British was the cry as the ship went down. Every man was steady at his post. Captain and crew, when they knew the worst, saving the women and children first. Be British is the cry to everyone, and though fate has proved unkind, oh, if you are willing, with a penny or a shilling, for those they left behind.
This is Beacon Park in Lichfield, and this is a statue to a great sea captain, Captain Edward John Smith, RD RNR. He wasn't born in Lichfield, he didn't live in Lichfield, he was born in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent. This statue was erected in 1914, and the original bronze plaque, which says, Commander Edward John Smith, RD RNR, born January 27th, 1850, died April 15th, 1912, bequeathing to his countrymen the memory and example of a great heart, a brave life, and a heroic death. Be British. There's no mention on this original plaque of the ship which is most connected with Captain Smith, the greatest liner of its day, the biggest ship in the world, the ship that was to be his greatest and his final command. That ship was the Titanic.
When the mighty ship Titanic started from Southampton Bay, there were tears and fond goodbyes too, as she proudly steamed away. But soon a last disaster came and filled our hearts with woe. Although in sorrow now we weep, we are proud to know. Every man at his post as the big ship went down, to save precious lives there we find them. They died like heroes true. Now something we must do for the wives and little ones they left behind them.
This is Wells Street, Hanley, and this is number 51. It's changed a bit now, but on the 27th of January 1850, it was the birthplace of Edward John Smith, later captain of the Titanic. Now, I think this is incredible, and I think it's incredible for two reasons. Firstly, because this is Wells Street, Hanley. It's not a Liverpool, it's not a Southampton, it's not a town with a famous seafaring or maritime tradition. It's a landlocked town. It's about as far away from the sea as you can possibly get. It's a town not of ships, but of clay and of coal. And I think it's incredible that a potter's son from Wells Street, Hanley, should get it into his head not just to go to sea, but to become captain of a transatlantic liner. The other remarkable thing about this is a little bit more subtle, but I think just as incredible. In those days, to be captain of a transatlantic liner was as much a social position as it was a navigational position. In other words, you got to be the captain of a ship such as the Titanic, not simply by being the best navigator or sea captain, but by having the social savoir-faire, the nous, if you like, to deal with the international, the transatlantic, rich and famous, the millionaire set who chose to sail not so much on a certain ship, but with a certain captain. There was something about Edward Smith that these people liked. He knew how to deal with them. He knew how to make polite and fascinating conversation on the captain's table. You'd think that someone who had that sort of savoir-faire would come from an aristocratic or at least a certainly very well-to-do background. But as you can see, this is an ordinary terraced house in an ordinary terraced street in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent. Captain Smith must have been a truly remarkable person to make his way from an ordinary house like this to the bridge of the Titanic. In other words, the transatlantic rich set, the millionaires, chose to sail with Captain Smith. And that's not bad for a lad from Wells Street, Hanley.
Well, the importance of Captain Smith seems to be worldwide. I mean, everybody, you know, the letters that I get from all over the world want to know about him. Have I got a photograph of him? Everybody I know from out of this country, and whenever they come to Stoke-on-Trent, they always want to go to Lichfield to see the statue, and they ask me why there is not a statue in Stoke. This telescope has always been on show in my house, and from when I was a little lad and asking about it, he said, "Oh, I'll show you one day." And when we came to Lichfield, that's when he showed me the statue, and ever since then I've always gone to look at the statue. Whenever I go through Lichfield, it's only 5 minutes, it's just off the main road, Beacon Park, I just go and have a quick look and away I come. I should think I've looked at that statue thousands of times.
We're here at Etruria Methodist Church in Stoke-on-Trent, which used to be called Etruria Wesleyan Church and Schools, because here we have a photograph of Captain Smith. He was, for a long time, a member of this Sunday school. He came to Sunday school, and he was also a member and worshipper at this church. The photograph was given, in fact, by the members of the old boys' school, because in addition to being a church and schoolroom, this schoolroom, in fact, served as the day school for the surrounding area. It was the first day school in the area, and therefore John Smith, as a young boy, would come to this school and would be taught in these rooms. When he worshipped as an adult in the church, of course, it's a church which dated back to 1805, and since that day has been virtually unchanged. As you can see, the church itself is a typical Wesleyan church of the early 19th century, with the gallery going all round and the central pulpit. This has remained intact from its planning and building in 1805. And it would certainly be like this in almost exactness when Captain Smith did in fact worship in this church in the 90s and early years of the present century.
Captain Edward John Smith, born Well Street, Hanley, January the 27th, 1850, son of Edward Smith, potter, and Catherine Smith.
Educated at Etruria British School and became steam hammer operator at Etruria Forge.
At the age of 21, visited a friend at Liverpool and applied to join the Mercantile Marine.
Outstanding career. Captain first ship at age 24.
Became Commander and Commodore of the White Star Line.
Premier Atlantic Captain.
62 years of age, he was the very type of a British sea captain. Quiet, with shrewd, keen eyes beneath his shaggy brows. Strong in command, gentle in social converse. Modest as a simple seaman, brave as a lion, of unblemished honour.
Though I believe he's an awful stickler for discipline. He's popular with everybody.
As vessels increased in size and power, Captain Smith changed from one ship to another and bore the burden of increasing responsibility. He commanded 17 White Star liners in succession, and he was known and loved all over the world by men and women who'd travelled with him. His employers had absolute faith in his skill and judgment, and his caution and strength of character, and his unswerving fidelity to duty.
When anyone asks me how I can best describe my experience in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say uneventful. Of course, there have been winter gales and storms and fog and the like, but in all my experience, I have never been in any accident of any sort worth speaking about. I have seen but one vessel in distress in all my years at sea, a brig, the crew of which was being taken off in a small boat in the charge of my third officer. I never saw a wreck and have never been wrecked, nor was I ever in any predicament that threatened to end in disaster of any sort. You see, I'm not very good material for a story.
Well, he seemed very large to me. I don't know whether he was, but he was very upright. And he had a beard, and he looked different from all the other sailors in my eyes, which indeed he was. Yes, he was very nice. Yes. I met him, I should think, perhaps 3 or 4 times. I only remember that my father spoke to him several times, and a couple of times I was with my father, and he took us somewhere. I'm quite sure it wasn't the bridge, but it took us somewhere which was where passengers didn't normally go. But I, of course, wasn't a bit interested at 7 years of age. But he was very nice, I remember that, and he greatly admired a doll I had. He was very nice to me.
Well, the telescope, it's been in my family ever since I remember. My father used to tell me about it. It is inscribed Captain E.J. Smith, and on the rear end of it, it says the Olympic. It as it was, apart the leather, I put the leather on because the handpiece had worn away over the years. It was in my father's collection. His father gave it to him, and it was the personal property of Captain Edward John Smith, my great uncle. I've also got a cigar holder that another uncle of mine gave me when I started collecting the personal items together. I've also got a pair of epaulets. In the photographs that you see of Captain Smith on the bridge, those are similar type of epaulets, but no doubt he had several pairs. I mean, he would have a set of those on every tunic that he'd got. I've got pocket watches as well. Two pocket watches actually that belong to Captain Smith, and of all of them is his sextant. This was in a coal house belonging to one of my uncles. He knew it was in the coal house but didn't know where. Of course, I've had all the box cleaned up, and as it was being cleaned, the initials came up on the box, EJS, Edward John Smith. Now the sextant is complete. There's nothing missing from it apart that it's slightly damaged. Now the date inside is 1909. Now the bit that's damaged, it looks as if it's been dropped. There's a piece of string attached to it. Now I've always left that string on. I don't know whether Captain Smith himself actually tied that knot on there or what ships this is sailed on. But as I say, it is complete in every way.
Well, my father was a builder, a master builder, and in England in 1911 business wasn't very good, and he had built a lot of houses which he couldn't let. Now that must sound very odd today, but it was so in those days. And when a friend of his who'd gone to Canada sometime earlier on came home to see him, he said, "You know, why are you putting up with this recession here? Why don't you join me in Canada? Together we could make a real do of things." And within the space of one evening, my father decided to cut all his losses and go to Canada to join his friend. Well, in those days, one went to New York by fast electric liners, one of which went every day of the week, I understand, and then on to Canada by train, because at that time of the year, when the St. Lawrence is frozen, one would have to go to St. John's or Halifax, which were small ports, and then a very tiresome journey across Canada from there. So we were going to New York. And my father made this decision this evening. I knew nothing about it, of course, I was in bed. But my mother was absolutely horror-stricken. Well, to really make the point there, I must tell you that my mother was quite a remarkable woman. She had married when she was quite young, and she was 18, and she'd married a very bad marriage, and her parents weren't at all pleased with her. But they were right and she was wrong. And by the time she was 31, she had had 9 children, 9 babies, and they had all died. She had known what it was to be desperately unhappy and poor, and her children died and left her absolutely bereft, and with all this trouble behind her, which I'm quite sure made for the wonderful character she had. She had no illusions about things. Her feet were firmly on the ground. And so she met my father, married him, and they were divinely happy. He was so good to her. And I was born, which added to her joy. She had a lovely home. My father had a motor car, which in those days was rather remarkable. And everything was wonderful until this night. And the moment this arrangement had been made to go to Canada, my mother had this dreadful premonition. She'd never had one before, and she never had one after. But she said, "No, we can't do this. It's quite wrong. Something dreadful will happen." And I tell you what the sort of woman she was. She'd got both feet on the ground, and for her to behave like that was absolutely unbelievable to everyone, but she just had that premonition. And my father said, oh, nonsense. And of course the time went by and the house was sold, and we were booked in a ship called the Philadelphia. And this cold strike came and she didn't sail. And we were then offered a berth in the Titanic, which absolutely delighted my father. I thought it was wonderful. The whole world was talking about that ship. I was 7. I'd read there was a big ship. It didn't really convey as much to us as it did to my parents, obviously. I mean, I'd never been in a ship at all before, so it didn't convey very much to me. But I do know everyone was talking about it. I remember the children at school saying, aren't you lucky you're going to Titanic? I can't really compare it with anything else. I'd never been in a ship before, but I've been in many ships since. I look back now and know it was very lovely. Very lovely. Boy, it was a cabin for 3. It was, I think really it was a 4-berth cabin, and 1 berth hadn't been put up because there were 2, the side where my father and I were, and my mother's was on that side. And she did an armchair and there was wash basin and that sort of thing in it. It wasn't a first-class cabin, it was a second-class cabin. But I've been in first-class cabins since that weren't as nice.
On Wednesday, April the 10th, 1912, the White Star liner Titanic started on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York.
A crowd gathered on the pier to watch the great ship leave her moorings, and as she began to move in her immensity, cheers rolled out across the water in a great chorus of pride and triumph.
The band was playing a merry tune on deck, and passengers leaning over the rails waved farewell greetings to their friends and gave answering cheers.
On her way out from Southampton, the Titanic had a triumphant progress, towering tremendously above all the craft, which seemed so dwarf-like as the shadow of her great hull passed across them on the glittering waters.
Never was there a ship such as this. She was 1,000 feet long, so that as she swung round, she looked like a moving fortress. The strength of her shell was like that of a castle with massive walls of steel.
The heaviest sea could never wash aboard. We may laugh at dirty weather.
Right throughout the hull are steel girders, beams and stanchions like the pillars of a cathedral to give her absolute rigidity in the heaviest sea. A system of watertight bulkhead doors has been designed with a massive construction which seems to defy the greatest danger.
Each door is held in the open position by a suitable friction clutch, which can be instantly released by means of a powerful electric magnet controlled from the captain's bridge, so that in the event of accident, the captain can, simply by moving an electric switch, instantly close the doors throughout, practically making the vessel unsinkable.
The Titanic could not sink.
The Titanic is unsinkable.
So in power, almost terrifying to the imagination, the Titanic was incomparable.
But in beauty and luxury also she had no rival. It seemed as if the builders of the Titanic had been riotous in their endeavour to make this greatest of ships the ultimate example of modern luxury, beyond which it would be impossible to go. On the 10 decks, you might forget the cares of life, the squalor and ugliness of life, even the duties of life. And in this sea palace of the Titanic Queen, spend the days of the voyage in continual pleasure and delight. These sound like words of exaggeration, but the Titanic was herself an exaggeration of ordinary things.
How many did you make it then?
Now let's have a look. First class passengers 322, second class passengers 277, steerage passengers 709, and crew 898, making a grand total of 2,206.
And she isn't even half full.
Talk about a millionaire's special.
Have you seen who's on board?
Colonel and Mrs. J.J. Astor.
Colonel Astor is one of the richest men in the world and served with distinction in the Spanish-American War.
Correct.
Mr. Benjamin Guggenheim.
The well-known American banker and multi-millionaire.
Major Archibald Butt.
Aide-de-camp to President Taft.
Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Strauss.
Who together rose from a small business in Philadelphia to make Macy's a national institution.
Ending in wealth, charity work, holidays, and a seat in Congress for Mr. Strauss.
Mr. W.T. Stead.
The famous journalist and reputedly William Randolph Hearst's chief advisor.
Mr. Thomas Andrews.
Managing director of Holland and Wolff.
Upon whose very vessel we now stand.
The Countess of Rothes.
Off to America to meet her husband.
Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon.
Her ladyship widely known as Society Modiste Lucille.
Mr. J. Bruce Ismay.
The managing director of the White Star Line. There was all the drama of life within that floating city, all that interchange of social courtesies, all those beginnings of pleasant friendships, all those partnerships of love which are to be found on a transatlantic liner. Some of these men were busy, no doubt, with the thoughts and schemes of ambition. planning out their future as they paced the decks, smoking quietly in the darkness and peace of night.
But she said to him, "Now, I don't want any more unhappiness about this, but my mind is made up, and I will not go to bed in this ship. I shall sleep in the daytime, and I shall sit up at night." And I so well remember what he said to her. He said, "If you want to be so stupid, I can't stop you." She said, "I know, but I'm going to do it." And she did. And she sat up Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, and on Saturday night she heard an odd sound, and she awakened my father and made him go up on the deck. And he came back and told her that it was ice floes that she could hear grinding against the side of the ship, and not to be so silly. And at breakfast the next morning, other people said they had gone up on deck. They had heard this sort of noise. And they agreed it was ice floes. And my mother then said, "Well, surely if there's ice in abundance in the sea, there could be icebergs." And this officer who was at our table, he said, "Oh, nonsense, it is an iceberg. It's an enormous thing. We should see an iceberg. You've nothing to be afraid of." And that was on the Sunday morning. And for the first time since we had gone on board the ship, she didn't get up from breakfast and go straight to bed, which was what she normally did, because it was Sunday and she thought she'd like to go to church, which she did. And then we had lunch together before she went to bed. And I remember that meal so well, because that was the last meal that the three of us ever had together. Because in the evening, by dinner time, I was in bed, of course. And she just came and joined in whatever was happening during the evening, that sort of thing. And my father got very cross, because he had every reason to dislike gambling. His father had been a compulsive gambler and had died utterly penniless from being quite a wealthy man. And so everybody was gambling on this Sunday night. They were making books, having service, and having sweepstakes as to what time she would get in so many minutes past so and so. My father would have nothing to do with it. And so he went to bed quite early, for him anyway. And my mother sat down to sew and read, and she looked up at him. He was reading. He said he'd got a very interesting book. But quite quickly he went to sleep, and she got up and took the book from him and settled down again.
Within the high steel walls of the Titanic, all that civilization means, all that human life means, was here gathered up. The rich men of the world, the heirs and heiresses of great fortunes, lay a few decks away from Irish emigrants and from the people of poverty. All sorts and conditions of men, the whole scale of human life, the whole gamut of human emotions, were enclosed in that palace ship. And though they knew it not, in a little while wealth and poverty, youth and old age, would be made equal before the face of eternity.
April the 14th, 8:55 p.m. Captain Smith and Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller are on the bridge. There is not much wind?
No, sir. It is a flat calm.
A flat calm.
In any case, there will be a certain amount of reflected light from the bergs.
No, yes, there will be a certain amount of reflected light. If you are the slightest degree doubtful, let me know.
All right, sir.
The life of the Titanic was settling down for the quietude of the night, and all those tired people had as perfect a sense of security as though they were going to bed in a great hotel. They had implicit faith in the safety of the ship, in the vigilance of the officers, in the caution of Captain Smith, that strong, calm, genial man who now and then had strolled into the staterooms with a cheery word or two.
In a way, a certain amount of wonder never leaves me, especially as I observe from the bridge a vessel plunging up and down in the trough of the sea, fighting her way through and over great waves. A man never outgrows that. April the 14th, 1912, 11:40 p.m.
Crow's Nest, there's ice ahead.
What did you see?
Iceberg right ahead.
Thank you. Iceberg right ahead, sir.
Hard to starboard. Full astern.
Hard to starboard. The helm is hard over, sir.
And she said at 10 minutes to 12, she felt a slight bump. And she said it was just like a train pulling into a station. It just jerked. It was very slight, but she said she knew that it was this dreadful something, and she wakened my father. She He wakened me, and my father said no, he wasn't going up on deck again after the night before. But she literally pulled him out of bed and made him go up. And she then said she was going to dress me, and I, being sleepy and very naughty, said I wasn't going to be dressed. Nothing to be dressed for, I'm going back to bed. My father came back very quickly, because he could get up to the boat deck in the lift very quickly from where our cabin was. And he came back and he picked me up and wrapped his blanket tightly round me, as if I were a baby. And my mother said nothing to him, and I used to say to her sometimes, years afterwards, I can't understand why you didn't say to him, what was it? Which she certainly did not say. And she said, I didn't have to say, what was it? I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was this dreadful something that I had to live with for months, and there was nothing more I could say.
Mr. Murdoch, what was that?
An iceberg, sir. I hard starboard, it didn't reverse the engines. I was going to hard a port around it, but she was too close. I couldn't do any more.
Close the emergency doors.
They're already closed, sir.
Go down and find the carpenter and tell him to sound the ship.
I'd been in my berth about 10 minutes when I felt a slight jar, but it was not sufficiently large to cause any anxiety to anyone, however nervous they may have been. The engines, however, stopped immediately afterwards. I went up on deck in my dressing gown, and I found only a few people there who'd come up in the same way to inquire why we had stopped. But there was no sort of anxiety in the mind of anyone. We saw through the smoking room window that a game of cards was going on, and I went in to ask if they knew anything. They'd noticed the jar a little more, and looking through the window, they had seen a huge iceberg go close by the side of the boat. They thought we'd just grazed it with a glancing blow, and they'd been to see if any damage had been done. None of us, of course, had any conception that the ship had been pierced below by part of a submerged iceberg. The game of cards was resumed, and without any thought of disaster, I returned to my cabin to read until we started again. I never saw any of the players or the onlookers again.
Up on the bridge, Captain Smith sent for Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland and Wolff, who had built the Titanic. Mr. Andrews had been on board to sort out any teething problems on the maiden voyage. He'd been working hard with his plans and notes, changed for dinner, and then returned to his stateroom for more work on his reports. He had hardly noticed the bump and knew nothing was wrong until the captain called him to the bridge. Things changed quickly. He and Captain Smith made an instant tour of the ship, hastily inspecting the damage below the waterline. She was taking water fast. The iceberg, scraping ruthlessly down the ship from the starboard bow, had cut a 300-foot gash in her side.
It was like this. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments running from side to side down the length of the ship. She could float with 2, 3, or even all of her first 4 compartments gone. But the gash down the side meant that 5 were flooded.
If Lookout Fleet had seen the iceberg a few seconds earlier, the Titanic would have swung around it. If he had not seen it at all, they would have hit it full on and perhaps have crumpled the bows. The slight glancing blow was far more deadly, slicing open 5 at a stroke.
The bulkhead between the 5th and 6th watertight compartments only went as high as E-deck, and as the Titanic went down at the head, the water would rise and spill over into the next compartment, and then the next, and the next.
It was inevitable that the Titanic would sink.
So he put his very thick coat on her, and put another one on himself, and without any words at all, we went out of the cabin, and into the lift and up onto the boat deck. Now, if we hadn't done that at that time, I very much doubt I'd be talking to you today, because, as you know, there was accommodation for less than 800 people in the lifeboats, and she was carrying 2,200. So it was a question as who was there in time to get into one of the all too few lifeboats. Well, they weren't launched very quickly, because at first no one thought anything was going to happen. But my father went away and spoke to an officer, and he said, they are going to launch the lifeboats, but you'll all be back on board for breakfast. And so they launched these boats, and my father helped. He knew a lot about the sea. And he put me in the lifeboat and told me to be good. He said to me, hold Mummy's hand, and I thought he was coming after me, but he didn't. Then it dawned on me, of course, that he wasn't coming, that I wouldn't see him anymore. And that collision was 10 minutes to 12, and the Titanic sank at 20 past 2. So if we had had enough lifeboats, no one would have died that night at all. And it would have been a 9 days wonder that the ship sank on its maiden voyage. It didn't matter, nobody died, that would have been that. And here we are all these years after, with the whole world still interested in the Titanic.
Below decks in the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were manning the Marconi system.
On the night of the accident, I did not even feel a shock. I was standing by Phillips, telling him to go to bed, when the captain put his head in the cabin.
We've struck an iceberg, and I'm having an inspection made to tell what it's done to us. You better get ready to send out a call for assistance, but don't send it until I tell you.
The captain went away, but in 10 minutes, I estimate, he came back. We could hear some confusion outside, but there was not the least thing to indicate that there was any trouble. The wireless is working perfectly.
Send a call for assistance.
What should I send, sir?
The Regulation International call for help.
Phillips began to send the CQD. He flashed away at it. We joked while he did so. All of us made light of the disaster. We joked that way while he flashed signals for about 5 minutes. Then the captain came back.
What are you sending?
CQD, sir.
The humour of the situation appealed to me. I cut in with a little remark that made us all laugh, including the captain. Send SOS, I said. It's the new call. It may be your last chance. Phillips, with a laugh, changed the signal to SOS. In the next few minutes, we picked up the first steamship, the Frankfurt. We gave her our position and said we'd struck an iceberg and needed assistance. The Frankfurt's operator went away to tell the captain. When he came back, we told him we were sinking by the head, and by that time we could observe a distinct list forward. The Carpathia answered our signal. We told her our position and said we were sinking by the head. The operator went to tell his captain, and 5 minutes later he returned and told us the Carpathia was putting about and heading for us. Every few minutes, Phillips would send me to the captain with little messages, merely telling how the Carpathia was coming our way and giving her speed. I noticed as I came back that they were putting off the women and the children in the lifeboats.
The ship's band, conducted by Mr. Hartley, whose name will be remembered always as one of the greatest heroes of the Titanic, assembled on one of the decks, and while the boats were being lowered, played selections from operas and the latest melodies. That merry music floating out above the quiet waters under the star-strewn sky set the keynote to this great melody of spiritual devotion to honour and duty. Let us look now at some of the single figures in this deadly drama.
Colonel Astor, the American millionaire,
was returning from his honeymoon. He'd given a helping hand with the boats and had spoken words of courage and good cheer to those who seemed frightened. Then he stood for a moment by the side of his beautiful bride.
I heard Colonel Astor tell his wife that he would meet her in New York. They exchanged an affectionate farewell, but no more affectionate than that of a couple just separating for a week instead of eternity.
As the boats with the women went away from the side of the ship, Colonel Astor stood for a moment at the salute. He called out a last farewell to his wife.
Goodbye, dearie. I will join you later.
Then he turned calmly and lit a cigarette and leaned over the rails, staring through the darkness.
Major Buck, President Taft's aide-de-camp,
had been close to Colonel Astor and had behaved with the chivalry and the quiet, cheerful courage of a gallant gentleman.
He was very calm. He gave his orders coolly and pacified men who were inclined to be panicky. I last saw him by the rail looking into the water.
Miss Young.
I was on the last boat that put off from the Titanic. I knew Major Butt in Washington, and we resumed our acquaintance on the Titanic. He was so cool and collected that he inspired all who came in contact with him with courage. He helped me to my seat in the lifeboat as coolly as if he were handing me to a chair in a drawing room. And when the boat was lowered, he stood on the deck and, taking off his hat, said,
"Goodbye,"
and smilingly waved his hand to me. He stood upon that watery deck as our boat pulled off, and the very last I saw of this brave man was while he stood there, waving his hat and smiling.
One of the stewards who was instrumental in getting the people away in the boat says that Mr. Benjamin Guggenheim, the New York banker, was offered a place in one of the lifeboats, but he refused, saying,
"I will not go. No woman shall remain unsaved because I was a coward."
Mr. Guggenheim gave the steward a message for his wife, which was afterwards delivered.
"If I don't turn up, tell my wife that I have done the best I could."
He was one of those who went down, but he and a friend found time to return to their cabins and put on evening dress. When the steward expressed his amazement, Mr. Guggenheim smiled and said,
"If we have to die, we will die like gentlemen."
The men all stood away and waited in absolute silence, some leaning against the end railings of the deck, others pacing slowly up and down. The boats were then swung out and lowered from A deck. When they were level with B deck, where all the women were collected, the women got in quietly, with the exception of some who refused to leave their husbands. In some cases, they were torn from their husbands and pushed into the boats, but in many instances they were allowed to remain, since there was no one to insist that they should go. Looking over the side, one saw the boats from aft already in the water, slipping quietly away into the darkness. Presently, the boats near me were lowered with much creaking as the new ropes slipped through the pulleys and blocks down the 90 feet which separated them from the water. An officer in uniform came up as one boat went down and shouted out,
"When you're afloat, row round to the companion ladder and stand by the other boats for orders."
Aye, aye, sir.
But I don't think any boat was able to obey the order, for when they were afloat and had their oars at work, the condition of the rapidly settling liner was much more apparent. In common prudence, the sailors saw that they could do nothing but row from the sinking ship, and so save at any rate some lives. They no doubt anticipated that the suction from such an enormous vessel would be more than usually dangerous to the crowded boat, which was mostly filled with women.
And we rowed away from the ship as fast as we could, because one has to do that, because I believe the suction when a vessel goes down is absolutely enormous. And we rowed away, and I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink. And I saw that ship break in half. And for so many years, people have argued with me about that. But now at last, it has been proven beyond all doubt that she did break in half. I know she did, I saw her. And the forepart went down nose first, and the stern of that ship stood up in the water for quite a long time, or it seemed a long time to me, and then keeled over.
As the Titanic slipped slowly and remorselessly into the ocean, the Leyland liner Californian was standing quietly 10 miles away. She was blocked in by the ice and had been stopped since the Titanic arrived. Like the Titanic, the Californian was a passenger ship, but unlike the Titanic, she was only 6,000 tons and wasn't even carrying any passengers at the time. By 11:30, the Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, was exhausted. He shut up his set for the night and flopped onto his bunk to flip through a magazine before finally turning in. Back on the bridge, apprentice James Gibson was intrigued by some lights out to sea. They hadn't moved for over an hour. Were they sending Morse? He tried to reply, but soon gave up. Second Officer Stone was up on the bridge too. It was strange, he thought, that a ship should send up rockets at night. Stone and Gibson counted 5 up to 12:55. Gibson tried the lamp again, but again he gave up. Raising his glasses, he spotted a 6th rocket burst into the sky. Second Officer Stone whistled down the speaking tube to Captain Stanley Lord, who was sleeping in his uniform in the chart room. Stone told him about the rockets.
Are they company signals?
I don't know, but they appear to me to be white rockets.
The captain told him to go on morsing. A while later, Stone passed the glasses to Gibson.
Have a look at her now. She looks very queer out of the water. Her lights look queer.
A little later...
A ship is not going to fire rockets at sea for nothing. Call the captain and tell him that the ship is disappearing in the southwest and that she has fired altogether 8 rockets.
Gibson hurried down to the chart room where Captain Lord was asleep on a couch. He told him what they had seen.
Were they all white rockets?
Yes.
What time is it?
5 minutes past 2 by the wheelhouse clock.
Captain Lord rolled over and went back to sleep. By 20 minutes to 3, the lights had gone.
Yes, and of course there are still threats of legal things even these days about whether the ship that was so close to us was the Californian or not. I mean, I saw that ship. It's terribly close. Now, the sort of thing that I must emphasise is people say this, say that, say the other. They're now asking me, was that the Californian you saw? I cannot possibly tell you. I've always been told, with Board of Trade inquiries and everything that went, that that was the Californian. But I, Eva Hart, can't make that statement, but I don't know. I mean, short of going up to the ship and looking at the name on it, you wouldn't know. I can't think that the 2 big inquiries, one in America and one here, which were held at the time, would have been wrong about that. But they're trying to say now, of course, that it was so, as you know. But I refuse to say that it was, because I don't know. And the other thing I'm saying is that I didn't see a ship 19 miles away. I saw a ship that was so close, and they said at the time it was less than 9 miles away. Now they're trying to say it was 19. I saw it, you know, it wasn't just lights on the horizon, you could see it was a ship. And I saw our rockets being fired, which that ship must have seen. Well, this inquiry says that they did see it, but they didn't think it was a portent of danger. But I would have thought in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of the night, that rockets must mean trouble.
And the band played on. The Titanic's musicians have become as great a part of the story as the iceberg itself. History depicts them up on the deck, playing on with heroic dignity as the waters finally closed around the doomed liner. Wallace Hartley assembled his men in the first-class lounge, and struck up a little ragtime. And as the great ship slipped still deeper and deeper into the water, the 8 musicians moved out onto the boat deck and played on louder into the starry night. People streamed out and on to the few remaining lifeboats, and with a rise of terror and emotions, Hartley and his men kept firmly to the steady ragtime beat. Then, with just 5 minutes to go, Wallace Hartley tapped his violin. The ragtime stopped, and the Episcopalian hymn Autumn rang out into the ice-cold night. But legend has it that Hartley and his men concluded with "Nearer, my God, to thee." Newspapers and magazines published the words and music, surrounded by solemn portraits of the brave musicians themselves. It looked and sounded right. Some of the survivors were sure it was the case, despite 2 different settings of the hymn, reproduced with equal confidence.
Well, there's no question about the fact that they played, and there's no question about the fact that after we were down on the water and they were playing, they played one version of the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, of which there are 3. I've had this out so many times. And the one they played was the one that was played in church some months after, when I was with my grandmother, and I was so frightened I came out of church. I ran out. I knew the tune so well. But they won't have it. The Americans won't have it. And people say, no, it's not it, but it was just ragtime. But it wasn't. It wasn't. But we were down on the ocean by then. They were, oh, yes, I could hear it, yes. I could.
Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee, e'en though it be a cross that raiseth me, still all my song shall be nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. Then let the wave appear, steps unto heaven. All that thou sends to me in mercy give, angels to beckon me, nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee.
I have a recollection of being absolutely petrified on a dark night with a sinking ship and people screaming. There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came up from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there. There wasn't any panic at the time I got in a lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there. And there were enough people there to just get into the lifeboats. But after that, when the others started coming up from their cabins and there were no boats, gosh, there was panic. We could hear it. Definitely. But the most dreadful sound of all is the sound of people drowning. The screams. Absolutely ghastly. My mother used to say sometimes, she couldn't get me to talk about it for years, but if ever anyone did talk to me and I said that, she used to say yes. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right. It's the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful. Dreadful. I can only tell you that I'm a terrible coward, and I never look at pictures of it going down, ever. When I get various books and things, I turn that page over very quickly. In fact, if you look through some of my Titanic books, you'll probably find a piece of paper slotted in that page, but I can't bear to look at it. It was I suppose it was a microcosm, is that the word? Looking at it from low down on the sea, it was dreadful, dreadful. I don't like looking at pictures of ships at all. I don't like pictures of the Titanic particularly because I can see it happening, you know.
Which brings us to the death of Captain Smith. Once again, the facts are not clear, and we are left with the legends. But even the legends do not agree.
3:11 a.m. Reuters telegram. Suicide of Titanic captain. New York, April 18. Titanic survivors state that the captain of the Titanic shot himself on the bridge. Reuter.
Captain Smith stood on the bridge, a calm, grave figure, conscious that the end was near. 2 words came down from him to the people who were crowding forward.
Be British.
It was a call to the old traditions of our race and manhood.
I saw Captain Smith alongside a raft. There's the skipper, I yelled. Give him a hand. They did, but he shook himself free and shouted to us.
Goodbye, boys. I'm going to follow the ship.
That was the last we saw of our skipper.
I saw him swim back onto the sinking ship. He went down with it in my sight.
The captain's last act was to save a little child. Soon after Mr. Williams had been hauled into the boat, Captain Smith swam up to it, supporting a baby in his left arm and swimming with his right.
Take the child,
he gasped. A dozen hands reached forth to grasp the baby, which was taken into the boat. Then they tried to pull the captain into the boat, but he refused.
What became of Murdoch?
He asked. Someone answered that he was dead.
The captain released his grasp of the gunwale and slowly sank before our eyes.
Someone somewhere has vouched for each of these myths, but which, if any, is nearest the truth, we will never really know. At 3:30 a.m., the rockets of the Cunard liner Carpathia were sighted by the survivors in the lifeboats. After picking up Jack Phillips's distress call, the 12,000-tonner immediately about turned and raced 58 miles from the south to the Titanic's last radioed position. Her usual speed was 14 knots, but that night she did 17. The Carpathia arrived with the dawn.
And we were picked up, as you know, in the morning by this little ship, the Carpathia. And the rescue of people from lifeboats in mid-ocean is quite a terrifying thing. These little boats, shall we say, draw up alongside, for want of a better expression, to what looks like an enormous vessel. She was quite a small vessel, the Carpathia, but she looked big from there. And then how do you get on board? You don't have a gangplank like you do when you're ashore. And so they opened a sort of, I don't know whether the word is right, a hatch in the side of the ship where the luggage used to be laid. And they threw down rope ladders, and people like my mother and other grown-ups had to climb up in mid-ocean up a swaying rope ladder, which she said was the most terrifying thing. The sailor behind sort of holding on. And then what can the children do? We couldn't climb up a rope ladder. So they got these big luggage nets, and the mesh is very wide apart. It's quite a big mesh. Children would have slipped through it, small children. Anyway, our legs and feet would have gone through. So each child was put in a sack. And I remember being petrified when I was put in that sack and it was tied round, and the sack full of these children were put into these huge nets, and quite safely, of course, hauled aboard. But that really was quite terrifying. Then having got on board, of course, I couldn't find my mother. And I didn't find her for hours, but eventually I found her. And I'm quite sure one of the most pathetic things must have been the whole of the next day, how these poor women, such as my mother, roamed about the ship looking to see if they could see the husband they left behind. But no one found anyone.
Of the 2,206 passengers and crew, 703 survived. A total of 1,503 were lost. The Carpathia, with its tragic cargo, steamed to New York, and the legend of the Titanic became public property.
New line of Titanic, it's an iceberg.
Wreck of the Titanic.
How the Titanic went down.
That's the story of the Titanic.
And we just went to New York in this little ship, and then my mother's first words were, when she landed, "How soon can I go home?" We came straight back here.
Lists of the Titanic's lost and saved were eventually posted outside the White Star Line's offices at Southampton. The dead were revered at a grand and solemn memorial service at St. Paul's Cathedral.
Though like the wanderer, the sun gone down, darkness be over me, my rest a stone, yet in my dreams I'll be nearer, my God, to thee.
Can you imagine what would have happened if the Titanic had gone down today? Can you imagine the outrage and the media furor that would have gone up? There would have been accusations, there would have been finger pointing, there would have been litigation on an international, practically a cosmic scale, wanting to know who was to blame and how did it happen. But in 1912, things were very different. Yes, of course there were inquiries. There was an inquiry in America and there was another one back in the United Kingdom. People, of course, did want to know what happened. But the media concentrated not so much on the loss of life and the responsibility. They focused on something different. They were concerned with how the Anglo-Saxon races, and the British in particular, had borne up and maintained the stiff upper lip. The British knew how to die. And that's why whenever today you look at any memorial to Captain Smith, you look at any popular media coverage of the sinking and aftermath of the Titanic, what they concentrate on is not blame, is not upon death, and it's not upon responsibility. What they focus upon is the dying words of Captain Edward John Smith of the Titanic. Be British.
There was no Borough Council move for any kind of monument to Captain Smith in Stoke, and it was left to a friend, William Hampton, to raise money for a plaque, which was sited in Hanley Town Hall. As for the statue, Bishop Boyd Carter raised an appeal and commissioned Lady Kathleen Scott, wife of Robert Falcon Scott, Scott of the Antarctic, who had also died in 1912, to make the statue. It was unveiled in Lichfield in 1914. Lichfield was chosen because it was seen to be more accessible and more convenient, and Stoke had already had its plaque in the town hall. The unveiling took place on a lovely summer's day on July 29th, 1914. Present were Lady Scott, Millicent, Duchess of Sutherland, Helen Smith, the captain's daughter, and Mrs. Eleanor Smith, the captain's widow. The Duchess of Sutherland gave an emotional speech.
We all pass through this world, partly masked, partly misjudged. It seems as if our real temptations, capabilities and qualities are unknown to so many until at last, in face of some crucial situation in life, at the command of our unbearing taskmaster, death, we are truly revealed and our characters stand as they should stand. Do not grieve too much that Captain Smith lies in the mysterious sea, which has swallowed silently many of the great, many of those we love, many of our darling dead. My friends, let us take great heart in this solemn scene and renew our courage, our own powers of self-sacrifice more strongly. For there hang over us menacing clouds that may call for our courage and powers of self-sacrifice. Let us see to it that we may never be lacking in that supreme hour. I ask Miss Smith if she will now unveil the statue.
Notably absent from the proceedings were members of the South Staffordshire Regiment, who should have been here but were called away on military manoeuvres. For within a week of the unveiling of a statue to the captain of the so-called Unsinkable Titanic, the Great War, the so-called War to End Wars, was to begin.
I should think I've looked at that statue thousands of times. Just a feeling of nostalgia. I just look at that and think, you know, he's a man who I would have loved to have met.
I entirely agree with my dear Dr. Ballard's words. He said the whole thing was a tribute to man's arrogance. And I agree with that. That man can be so arrogant as to build something and claim that it is undestroyable, if you like. It's the most arrogant thing to say. True, if the Titanic had struck rocks or a tempest and storm and sunk, that would be one thing, but this was a ship that needn't have had any loss of lives. No one should have died. Had she had enough lifeboats with 2.5 hours and a very smooth sea, nobody would have died. And one life is worth more than the whole ship, surely. That is what I saw, that is what I remember. And there are hardly any of us now to share this memory, of course. I'm the only living survivor now that can remember it and get about, so to speak. I don't think there's anyone that can really tell the whole story of it, except myself.
The British was the cry as the ship went down. Every man was heady at his post. Captain and crew, when they knew the worst, saving the women and children first. The British is the cry to everyone, and though fate has proved unkind, but you are willing with a penny or a shilling for those they've left behind.